It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
A lot of the good parenting messages which we talk about now is framed around how we can communicate and become better communicators, as well as understanding kids' motivations and also as well as understanding how families operate.
And now here's the stars of our show, my mum and dad.
Every now and again on the Happy Families podcast, we get to make big announcements. We get to share things with you that we think are going to be really, really interesting for you and have significant ramifications for the way that we do business and the way that we try to help your family to be happier. Today, one of those conversations is going to happen, and I'm really excited to be able to introduce you to Michael Grose. Michael has, for the last 30-odd years, been involved in parenting education around Australia and even overseas. He's written a handful of books and run a business called Parenting Ideas. Michael's been well acquainted with parents throughout the nation for a very long time, and he joins me on the Happy Families podcast today. Michael, thanks for joining me.
That's a pleasure, Justin. Thanks for having me on.
I'm really curious, Michael. What were the big issues that parents worried about most back in the 1990s when this all began?
It was behaviour. It was how do I get my kids to behave was the big issue. So I guess back then, parenting was code for managing kids. You know, I'm going to a parenting seminar. Oh, you're going to a seminar to learn how to manage the kids. And there's a reason for that, because society then had undergone a huge shift. So right up to the early 70s or mid 70s, we lived in a hierarchical society, which was sort of, men were up there, women were down there, adults were up there, kids were down there. And that's why we legally hit them in schools. And that's why, sort of corporal punishment was around. And then there was a huge shift in the 70s and into the 80s. And parents and school and teachers have been left behind. So suddenly it was no longer corporal punishment anymore. No longer was it hierarchical respect, because respect used to be a hierarchical. Come on, you respect your elders. You call them auntie and uncle and all the rest of it, and you call your teacher Mr. and Mrs. So very much that a hierarchical society. And then there was a shift into a more flat earth, and school teachers struggled with the whole notion of behaviour management, and parents did too. So a lot of their tools were taken away, which was largely coercion or however else you go to do this sort of thing. And how do I get my kids to cooperate? And what it actually had shifted really was the notion of respect. No longer was it hierarchical respect, it was more mutual respect. We've got to treat each other respectfully. So if, back in the day, back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, that a parent could be fairly mean to a child under the name of, I'm the parent, I'm a hierarchical, I'm doing this for your best interest, I'm making the decisions. And so by and large, that would fit, that would work. That approach didn't work in the late 80s because a whole bunch of stuff happened in our society. And so teachers and parents in particular really struggled. So when I worked at Monash, we called it the Monash Parent Teacher Education Centre, we had hundreds and hundreds of people come to our courses up there. And it was all about how do I get my kids to cooperate with each other, and how do I discipline my kids? So of course what we talked about then was the notion of consequences. So a lot of it was natural consequences, logical consequences as well. So that was the big issue. Sibling rivalry was the big issue. And if you're raising teens, and I remember this very, very vividly, the big issue for teens around teens was drugs. And parenting there was a fair bit of money around in schools and at that time linked to drugs. So the thoughts were that if you can create a safe, happy family, kids are less likely to take hard drugs as they move on. And so there was that link there. So that was a huge issue. You always had to address that. That's probably the number one. And my first presentation, which I used to run in the 90s, was called Devils, Darlings and Discipline. And it worked gangbusters. It was better than my first topic. My first topic was parenting the primary school child, and people stayed away in droves. And as soon as I changed that to Devils, Darlings and Discipline, it worked well. And I used to talk about the notion more about focusing on yourself as a parent. So a lot of parents struggled to get cooperation from the kids. They're always telling the kids what to do. And the notion of Adlerian psychology, which was the psychology which we learnt at Monash, was that you don't tell kids what to do, you focus on yourself, which is an interesting notion. So it's a flip. And it's more a communication method, and how do we communicate to get what we want with kids? And as you've seen over the journey, a lot of what we talk about is how do you communicate with your kids? How do you get messages across? How do you talk to your teenager so that your teenager will listen rather than tell? So, a lot of the good parenting messages which we talk about now is framed around how we can communicate and become better communicators. As well as understanding kids' motivations, and also as well as understanding how families operate. And I guess if there's one shift that I've noticed in the time is way back then, parenting was more family focused. There was a lot of people who came to our courses, and when I ran my own courses and wrote, a lot of it was around how you can get your family to gel, how you can decrease sibling rivalry. And that's always an issue. That's a golden issue which continues to this day. But how do you get your family to gel? How do you get it all together? And that's been a massive shift because, and my research project for my master's back then was looking at family size. And I noticed that parenting changed when size changed. So families with 4 kids, it was very much a group-based parenting. We're all in this together. If there was a discipline issue, well, we're all going home. We're all going to miss out because you've messed up. Mum and dad were less likely to be involved with the minutiae of kids' lives. And so those kids had more space as away from psychological space. If you had 2 kids or less, parenting was very much an individual endeavour. Mum and dad would say, I'm parenting you, John, and I'm parenting you, Mary. And I'm disciplining you, John, I'm disciplining you, Mary. So it was very much more individual parenting. And that's common sense because the more kids you have, and you know this, the more kids you have, the more you give them space, the more you know about, you don't know every little thing which has happened, and you're more concerned about making the family gel. So what's happened since I started is we've dropped a kid off one child has dropped off the perch. In other words, when my parents raised me back in the 50s and early 60s, the mean number of children in families was 4. That was in 1961. When I had my kids in the 80s, the mean number of kids was 3. Now we know in families the mean number of kids is 2. So over generations, we've dropped off 1. And now we've moved away from a more family-centric to a child-centric way of parenting. And that's neither good nor bad. It just is. But that's been a shift, a definite shift.
After the break, we're going to talk a blittle bit more about these trends and how things have changed, and also find out what Michael's most proud of after 30 years of parenting education.
It's the Happy Families Podcast.
For a happier family, try a Happy Families membership, because a happy family doesn't just happen. Details at happyfamilies.com.au.
It's the Happy Families Podcast, the podcast for the time poor parent who just wants answers. Now, hanging out today with Michael Grose from Parenting Ideas, celebrating the best part of 30 years as a parenting educator. I just thought, what a fascinating story to hear a school teacher who's ended up at a university doing a master's to become a better educator, who leaves education entirely to start helping parents and families. And 30 years down the track, we're looking at those big issues that used to exist. As I'm thinking about all the things you've talked about, Michael, and so many things that I'd love to pick up on, but timing is going to get away from us. I'd love to know, what are you most proud of when you think about the last 30 years as somebody who's helping families?
That's a really good question. There's the ego things that you're sort of proud of, and the success, the tick the box, and there's also the sort of legacy and things. So I'll actually touch on a couple of those. I was really proud to have been the first person to conduct a parenting seminar to federal politicians in Parliament House in 2004, which was a real hoot, a really great experience. And then we conducted that kicked off a tour, an Australian tour, which was federally funded, where we travelled around Australia, giving parenting seminars back in 2004. And that was a great experience. And that's something which is enabled me to grow as a person as well, because we got in front of so many different audiences. I also love the fact that for about 6 years, we do an annual tour in the UK and spoke there. And that was fascinating because we went from places such as Petersley, which is where Billy Elliot was filmed, which was very low socioeconomic, through to top-end private schools as well, and talking to parents there. So they were fascinating experiences. So from an experiential point of view, and I've been really fortunate to have a broad breadth of experiences. I guess the thing you're proud of is, you always love the fact that the work you do has meaning. And I think I've been able to sort of be on the pulse of raising kids for a long period of time. And I've probably influenced what you do when you're right about how you raise kids. You're certainly influencing people in a positive way. And I guess that probably the nicest thing, I know it's a weird thing to say, but when I look at my own 3 kids, and I've got kids, all in their mid-30s, they've all got kids. One has 2, one has 3, one has 2. And they're all doing pretty well. They do it in their own way. And so, and they don't take advice from me, but they do listen as well. So, which is good. They probably take more practical parenting advice from their mother or my wife, who is a terrific hands-on parent. So, and that's nice that I've been able to sort of maintain that relationship. Not in a domineering way, but they actually looked at some of the ideas which I've had and sort of put them into practice. So yeah, lots of things. It's very fortunate to be able to talk and write about something which is meaningful, something which is ethical, and something which probably leaves a legacy which I'll never see, but it's a nice thing. But most people in their jobs do a good job and they don't see the results of it as well, because the person when you walk into the shop and you say something nice to them, if you're the shopkeeper, and they walk out with a smile on their face, that's a terrific legacy as well. So we all want to sort of have a positive impact on others. So I guess that's the proudest thing.
Michael, our time is up. We need to wrap things up. But just before we do, thank you for sharing your experiences, your insights, your memories, your recollections of some 30-ish years of parent education. I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, there's some major news that we were going to share at the conclusion of our conversation. Would you like to share it?
Thank you, Justin. I will. I began a company called Parenting Ideas about 1998, I think it was, and it's been my baby, my pride and joy. We've grown it over the years, and we work a lot with schools as well. So we have schools memberships as well as talking with mums and dads. And I've reached a stage and age in my life where it's time to move on and do other things. But what do you do with Parenting Ideas? Well, what you do with Parenting Ideas, which has got a terrific name for quality parenting education, is you look for someone who has the experience, expertise, and credibility to take it over. And that person happens to be the person who's running this podcast, which is Dr. Justin Coulson. So, yeah, we've been working together for a while to make this happen. So as of yesterday, Parenting Ideas is now under the auspices of Dr. Justin Coulson. Is that the news you're talking about?
I think that might be the news, yeah. So what I really wanted to do was bring you on the podcast and celebrate the great work and the legacy that you've created for parents in this country. I actually haven't shared this in the conversation yet, but I was a high school graduate in 1993. And I still remember around about that time, my mum going to Erin Affair on the New South Wales Central Coast so that she could listen to a Michael Grose parenting seminar back in the early 1990s. Wow. Because I was giving her so much grief, obviously, that she needed some help. And
help. Yeah.
I believe that you were helpful. She came away and was grateful for the opportunity that she had to hear you and be involved. So you've actually been a part of my life and my family's experience since the 1990s at the very least. So thank you for what you've done. Thank you for the legacy that you've left. And thanks for trusting me with the opportunity to take on Parenting Ideas and see what we can do to grow that and make it part of the Happy Families family.
That's a pleasure. Thank you. And I'm glad I know that. That ties things up. And that's what we talk about. You just don't know who's sitting there in an audience or reading your book or your article or whatever, who's been touched by it. So Lovely. Thank you, Justin.
And to our Happy Families podcast audience, maybe a little bit self-indulgent to be sharing that news, and I hope that you'll join with me in celebrating what has been a remarkable parenting education journey for Parenting Ideas and Michael Grose. Really, really honoured and delighted to be able to take on the role of running that as well as Happy Families. As always, the Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon, and the executive producer is Craig Bruce. If you'd like more info about making your family happier, you can check out all the information that you need at parentingideas.com.au or happyfamilies.com.au.